Hello, and welcome to the Canadian Story, where we discuss what Canada is, what Canada could be, and what Canada should be. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Canadian Story. I'm very pleased to welcome one of my closest, dearest friends, Daniel Pujdak, who is probably my closest friend who I didn't agree with when I first met him on almost anything politically, but yet we've come to be dear friends who agree on most things. So it was a really probably one of the most transformative friendships of my life. He's one of the smartest people I know, and I'm just really happy to have him on here. So Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's so good to be here, and I loved your introduction. I agree with most of it. I don't think we agree on everything, but I think that we've learned
almost
in a very good way how to respectfully disagree and how to find the principles that motivate each of us to understand one another's views.
Exactly, and I think that's the foundation, is that we kind of worked through it to come to a foundational understanding of respecting each other's views, but also being willing to understand each other's views and maybe even change our own perspectives.
Absolutely. I think that it's one of the most interesting things. As you know, I grew up on Long Island, New York. I moved to Canada when I was 18. I went to university here. I didn't know what to do after I graduated my undergrad, so I stuck around and I got another degree, still in Canada. And as you know, I started working with indigenous peoples. And coming from New York, moving to Canada, I didn't really, I wasn't an expert in the field. I had no lived experience in it. I was working with people coming from communities I had never visited on topics that I understood intellectually and academically. It is one of the most unique things about Canada that we are big enough to have a lot of diversity and yet small enough that you can really find a place, engage with new things, engage with new ideas, find consensus, find new ways of seeing the world, and you can grow along with the rest of the country. And it's what makes me so happy to have stayed in Canada.
Yeah, well, and he answered the question before we even asked it, which is beautiful. This is a skilled man. So yeah, for the listeners, Dan and I met on Parliament Hill at one of the receptions, and ended up just enjoying our conversation so much that we went for a post-reception McDonald's, basically, and just never stopped talking really after that. So why don't you share your perspective of that development? Basically, I have this theory that all relationships are just a long conversation, and that to truly understand another person, you have to talk to them, and that the best relationships are deep, meaningful conversations. So Dan and I have that, and I'd like him to share kind of how his perspective on conservative, because just for those who don't know, Dan was a liberal, and I was actually you weren't partisan at that point, but definitely more of the more progressive liberal side of things, and I was on the very conservative, working for Stephen Harper when we met side of things. So why don't you share your perspective on how that developed, and I'll share mine, and we could talk about. I think I agree with you. I think that's one of the most beautiful things about Canada is those kind of conversations that can help us understand one another.
Yeah, I fully agree. There's this Canadian ethos about disagreeing without being disagreeable.
That's a great line.
Which makes it so much more interesting and fascinating, and frankly possible to engage with people who don't see the world the same way that you do. When we first met, I was working with indigenous groups. As I recall, at the time, the government was moving through a fairly large, contentious omnibus bill. Yes. There was a lot of contention around that. Absolutely. There were protests starting. I think we met before Idle No More really happened, but not
around that time. It was I think like a couple months, or maybe like because that happened in the spring, right? And I think we met in around Christmas time. Yeah, so that started. That really started in I believe that November. The protests in Ottawa, the hunger strikes, that was December. So maybe that was actually going on when we first met. I can't recall that exact component of it, but what I do recall was our first conversation. We were both pretty clear that we saw the world in different ways.
And you're right. We just continue to talk about it. It was an ongoing conversation. It's been, the best word for it is it becomes an investment in one another and an investment in I feel, in our personal growths too, because you consistently challenge me to see the world differently.
And you do the same.
and I feel as though I've really grown in my ability to collaborate with people simply by continuing to have these conversations with you and with other people who I disagree with on a regular basis.
Yeah, what do you think it is about Canada that allows us to do that I'm not going to say it right, but whatever, compared to America?
Vice versa.
No, vice versa. It's vis-a-vis. Vis-a-vis. There it is.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that there's a few things. I think, for Canada's not a particularly partisan country compared to the United States. We have three major parties that some people feel very affiliated with, but I don't think the vast majority of Canadians do feel very strong partisan affiliations to any one or the other. In fact, I believe that party registrations in Canada are significantly lower than they are in the United States.
I think it's like the lowest in the developed world, actually. Like less than 2% of Canadians have party membership. Way less, actually, I would think. Have party memberships, yeah.
I concur with that. And I think that there's a big difference within our partisan culture, which is that we actually have lots of consensus on the big chunky things.
Yeah, exactly.
The parties really disagree at the margins of policy. I think, a great example of that would be immigration. Every party agrees that immigration is a good thing. They don't all agree on how to get it done or what good looks like, but nobody's questioning the core principle there. Similarly, I think, across political ideologies, everybody recognizes that reconciliation is an absolute imperative for the country. Yeah. I don't think everybody agrees on how to get there. I don't think folks agree on what good looks like in terms of the role of government, in terms of how to have the right conversations. But nobody's attacking the principle. They're attacking the margins of how to get things done.
Yeah. And I think you're right. I think having the three parties actually makes that a lot more possible. Because actually, the person who introduced us was a member of the NDP and a very staunch, caring, one of my favorite individuals, Melissa. And in the end, we were in three different parties, but we always enjoyed hanging out with one another. And we were as radically partisan as you could get. We're like on the front lines in the campaigns, writing the attack ads sometimes, building out the campaign infrastructure, door knocking. So we're obviously committed members of our parties, and yet we always enjoyed being together. And I think not having it split between just two is such an essential part of the Canadian ethos when it comes to politics.
So, I'm curious to ask you. You were, part of politics for way longer than I was. How did you learn to take your partisan hat off and
honestly, it was someone like yourself. I was honestly, when I first got to Ottawa, it was 2011, and then 2012 was when I met you when I was working for the Prime Minister that fall and winter, and it was. Actually, this is a funny story. So I met Melissa smoking outside of the office building, right? And I would go for smokes, and you just end up talking to people that you're having smokes with. Now, I'm not encouraging smoking or anything like that, but there's a very communal aspect to smoking where you end up talking to one another because you keep seeing one another. And at the time, I guess you were smoking as well. And so even when we were at bars, we would go out and have smokes and just talk, right? And I've always found that produced a kind of environment of openness that I wouldn't have had otherwise, because I was, homeschooled, raised in an evangelical home, a radical conservative partisan for my whole youth. But it was those bar conversations, those smoking conversations, those conversations over dinner with yourself and Melissa and eventually others that just opened me up to, these are people. We have way more in common than we have differences. Like we enjoy the same things about life, and our lives are so similar because we're working in the same sphere. And that was really what opened me up to it. And then those dialogues over years just make you realize that as important as I think the political system is to have that, shifting of power and not allowing one group to hold power all the time, it doesn't have to be visceral and it doesn't have to be existential.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's this really interesting concept called requisite diversity, and it's a cybernetics concept. The basic idea of it is, you need complexity to absorb complexity. You need diversity to absorb diversity. And Canada, as you know, is a very diverse place, and the policy questions are extremely complex. The ability to have those cross-party conversations, cross-viewpoint conversations, I think, ultimately is one of the factors that is integral to the success of Canada. Now, there's a flip side to it, right? Which is it takes a really long time to build consensus. As you said, relationships are these conversations that you just keep showing up to. One of the tricks is how to keep people invested in a long conversation where it doesn't necessarily feel like there's progress, where people are learning, where people are going to ultimately come to better outcomes, better decisions, better ways of working, better ways of collaborating, and yet the road is long.
Yeah. And I think what it has to come down to is, regardless of the other person's opinions, you have to respect and enjoy that person as a person, which goes back to what you said earlier that I absolutely love. You could disagree without being disagreeable, right? And I feel like that's somewhat been lost a little bit, maybe not necessarily in Canadian culture, but just in this, weird culture war that it seems to be going on. I loved what you said about complexity and diversity, and complexity being necessary to understand complexity. You've been you've been heavily involved in the policy process. You are a policy mind. You now write for policy think tanks. You're engaged in that whole space. How do you see the complexity of the problems we face versus the simplicity of how they're often described? And how do you think that we could better communicate that these are really difficult problems that are being dealt with, and they shouldn't be boiled down to I like it or I hate it, or I love it or I hate it?
People absorb things in very short sound bites, and that's a difficulty. And that difficulty is amplified with social media. It's amplified with the attention span that people put into reading an online article. So I don't think that there is necessarily a way to drive home the full amount of complexity for most people. I think that a big question for the policy process is how to pull in the diversity of views given the limited number of people likely to engage in policy itself.
Yeah.
And that's a huge question. The ability to represent, consider, and come out with ideas that represent a diversity of views is really an important part of building trust in our institutions, building trust in policy ideas. It can help tear down, I think, part of the perception that policy folks are a bunch of elites who, sit in an ivory tower and have no idea of the common person's experience. So I think I would sort of flip that question around to say, how do we bring more diversity of thought and diversity of lived experience into policy conversations? And I think that is really the key.
And I couldn't agree more. I think one of the problems we actually face in the policymaking process is that we have stakeholders that are so invested in the outcomes, and yet the people who are impacted by the outcomes are not necessarily the stakeholders, right? And so I love that. And that's something that I think policymakers need to think a lot more about, is how do you get the perspectives of the people that are impacted on a smaller scale and not necessarily to the level that a major stakeholder is. If you're just listening to the major stakeholders and not looking at the overall impact, you're not being a thoughtful policymaker.
Well, policy lives in a system, right?
Yeah.
And to the point that you're making, you have to take a systems view towards it. If it is just a beautiful policy that doesn't fit into everything, then you're not necessarily producing benefit for Canadian society. Part of the other thing that sometimes gets a little bit lost in the policy world is this concept of what you can engineer versus what has to grow a little bit more naturally. Brian Crowley over at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute wrote a great book about this, where he talks about it as gardening versus engineering. That's also an important part of considering how it is that we approach these massive societal complex questions where lots of different views are happening. Are we setting up garden boxes and letting things grow, or are we trying to build a machine where we understand every lever? And those are really different views towards policy, and could lead to very different outcomes in terms of process and the ability to attract the diversity of thought required into them.
So there's two other things that I want to get to today. The first is I want you to talk about, because we don't have enough of this on the podcast, about coming into Canada and then getting so many opportunities to engage at high-level policy discussions and be at the table. I feel like it's something that is so unique to Canada. Like, both you and I did not come from wealthy backgrounds. We didn't come from the elite, quote unquote, but we're given so many opportunities by this country so early in our lives. What was that like for you as an American, the land of freedom, and yet you come here and there's so much freedom that you're given, and maybe even more opportunity than you would have had in the States. So we won't make that comment, but you know what I mean? Like, you got to come right to the big boys table very early on, and so did I. And we met when we were both doing that, right? And that's a special experience, and I don't think a lot of Canadians understand how special it is because they're just in Canada, but from that outside perspective coming in.
It's one of the most amazing things about Canada is you can make a change, you can engage, you can get involved, and the barriers to entry, there are barriers to entry for sure.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
But they aren't completely and totally insurmountable. Like I said before, I grew up in New York. I moved to Canada when I was 18. I did 2 degrees here in Canada. I graduated and started working with indigenous peoples. And there was nothing in my career trajectory that, would have made sense on paper. It's sort of like that old Looney Tunes thing of like wrong left turn at Albuquerque.
Yep.
Often I've felt like that has been the pathway. And the funny thing is, if I tried to talk to 18-year-old me and I told 18-year-old me all the things that would happen to me in my career and asked 18-year-old me to plot out the pathway of how to get there, 18-year-old me would laugh at me and go, yeah, no, there's no way that any of that is happening.
That's not happening.
So, I mean, to this question of the opportunity in Canada, I can look backwards from where I am today and present you a very coherent story of how I got here. That coherent story, wouldn't be true to the actual experience. It would just be, my retrospective. Right.
It would be a retrospective rationalization. Yeah.
But if I were to pull out some of the big lessons of it, it is Canadians are generally speaking friendly and welcoming and ready to engage in conversations. And if you come also ready to engage in conversations with ideas and a real, genuine desire to contribute to things, it's not, you can get involved. There are pathways for you. You can really absolutely make a change.
Yeah. And I think it's pretty cool that you could come here and do that. And we're so welcomed as someone, like in some countries, like you have to have been here for a while. Your family has to be here for a while. You just showed up and were like, you had the passion for it and you just went out and did it.
Yeah. I think it's, to the point that I made before about some of the policy pieces that are just consensus in Canada. I immigrated here. Now, look, my immigration experience is a lot easier than most immigrants would have. My first language is English. I have Canadian degrees.
Yeah.
So, I absolutely did not hit a lot of the barriers that many other immigrants would find. But to the point that, immigration is an integral part of Canada, I forget the numbers of how many immigrants we have per year, and I
About
remember
400, depends on the year, but between 350 and 500,000, I think.
Yeah, and I remember seeing some stat that close to half of all Torontonians were born abroad, and it's very high numbers, similarly in many urban areas in Canada. I think that it's amazing that in Canada you don't have to be second, third, fourth, fifth generation Canadian to jump in and really make a change, get your hands dirty, find opportunity, and grow relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so now for the meat of what we're going into, I think this is an important distinction, and I love that you're coming on as an American, a former American, to talk about it. Well, I guess you're a dual citizen.
I'm still
exactly. You're still American too. Rights, responsibilities, and interests. You have some really good things to say about this. It's deep. It's going to be a little bit intellectual for some people, but I think this is the most important conversation we can be having right now in Canada on a philosophic and policy level. So can you explain to the listeners your view on that, and then how the Americans have had maybe a more robust conversation on this than we have, and maybe where we need to go in conversation as Canadians to kind of it's a conversation we need to have.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about it a little bit. The concept of rights, responsibilities, and interests, they're all three really different things, right? They're interrelated, but they're not the same. And in an environment where people are trying to understand how they as an individual relate to society, and the obligation of a society back to individuals, the role of government in individuals, the role of government in society, these three concepts become really, really important to break down and have a deeper understanding of. As you know, rights are the rules of the road for our relationships, both with one another and with respect to government and with respect to the state, et cetera, et cetera. There are lots of different ways to talk about rights. One way that I find really helpful to talk about is the concept that there are negative rights. And it's not that they're bad, negative. It's that they're negative because there's an obligation for somebody to not do something. So, for instance, on your right to, I don't know, your rights to. I'm struggling to come up with an example off the top of my head.
Maybe your right to movement in Canada, right? So that someone can't stop you from going somewhere. Yeah.
Exactly. Nobody can illegally detain you while you're moving. Your right to, free speech, sure, there are boundaries to that right. But by and large, nobody can come in and tape your mouth shut and handcuff you and say, sorry, you can't speak anymore because I don't like what you're saying.
Yeah. That's a right. Exactly. That's a negative right.
Yeah, you can talk about it in terms of a negative right. You could also talk about the same concepts from a positive lens, and the idea of a positive right is where there is an obligation to do something. So it's the converse. So where these things start to get really interesting is that you can interpret most concepts of rights from both a negative and a positive lens, and in the U.S., I feel that we've internalized this conversation a little bit more. There's a Bill of Rights. It's been around for a long time. People understand that there's a freedom of speech, but there's no obligation for, let's say, the government to give you a platform or for a media outlet to hear your point of view. That right simply doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. What might exist, though, is your interest to get on a platform, your interest to be interviewed, your interest to appear on this podcast.
Right. There you go.
Yeah. People can freely pursue their interests, basically to their heart's content within the scope of law, within the scope of, their rights. And it's a way for you to implement your rights. It's an exercise of it. You're exercising your interest pursuant to your rights to do whatever or not. You have a right to vote. Do you have an interest in voting?
Right.
That's up to you.
I do, but yeah, that's up to you. Exactly.
That is totally up to you. Why does this stuff get really important? Because the language of rights, I feel, is coming up more and more in a lot of the conversations about Canadian society. I think we're seeing it in terms of things like mask mandates. and COVID-19 response. I think that we're seeing it in terms of conversations around academic rights. I think we're seeing it in terms of free speech debates. And it'll be really interesting to see where Canada and Canadians go with this and how they start to understand their own rights to and interests, their relationships to one another throughout all of this.
And let's go on then the responsibilities, because that's kind of the third pillar, right? I feel like I completely agree. We're having a lot of conversations about rights right now, and it's group rights, it's individual rights, it's the competition between public good and personal freedom. These are very complex and important discussions to be having as a grown-up country. I like to say that we're a teenage country coming into young adulthood and figuring out who we are, and but one of the things I feel like we're not talking about and that we need to talk about more is responsibilities. So can you lay out how that is different than the other two?
Absolutely. Responsibility is the other side of a coin from your right. Every right comes with a corresponding responsibility. Yes, you have a right to free speech, and you have a responsibility that comes with that right. You can't run around. I suppose you could run around saying absolutely crazy things that might not be in your interest to.
Right.
But you do have a responsibility in how it is that you act consistent with your right. Why is that really important? The responsibility side, being the other side of the coin, is kind of the thing that makes all the rights work together.
Yes, yes.
You and I can practice or exercise our rights in ways that could be highly inflammatory towards one another, that could seed conflict. We might be fully within our right to do so, but we have a responsibility to one another.
Yeah, exactly. Why do you think we're not talking about that nearly as much right now?
I think it's to the point that you talked about before on policy. It's really complex. There's no good soundbite for this. No,
it has to be a long conversation.
Exactly.
I really, because of your expertise on this and because I think it's a really important topic right now, can you walk us through the rights, interests, and responsibilities of Canada's relationship with First Nations?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question.
Yeah.
And I'll preface this by saying that there is zero consensus on this.
Yeah.
So I can lay out a little bit of what some of those conversations look like, but with a big disclaimer. That this is by no means, etched in stone.
No. This is an ongoing conversation, like you said.
Yeah, it's a massive ongoing conversation. I think that the term that comes up the most, or very frequently at very minimum, in talking about the relationship between Indigenous peoples in Canada and the Crown, is the relationship of rights. It's enshrined in the Constitution, Section 35. It's right there. There are concepts around treaty rights. There are concepts around inherent rights, so rights that might not have been written down in treaties, but that come by virtue of having been here since time immemorial, Indigenous people, that is. There are rights that come alongside the expectations of how the relationships ought to go. There are lots and lots of different types of rights, but the two that you hear the most about are treaty rights and inherent rights. Those, I'm going to take one quick pivot here to explain something.
Yeah, no, please do.
Which is, when people disagree about rights, there's no negotiation to be had.
Right.
You can only settle a conflict over rights through courts or some third-party authoritative source that steps into it. Imagine you got illegally detained, right? Your right has been denied.
Yeah.
You're not going to negotiate with the person who detained you about the length of your illegal detainment and the infringement on your right. You're going to go get a lawyer.
Yeah.
Or you're going to seek, some form of intervention from some form of legal authority to solve that situation. Why is that important? Most of the conversations in this space are about rights, and they can be very difficult conversations to have because where there is not agreement, there are few good pathways to figure out some better way to have a conversation.
Right. Yeah, because rights are in conflict in a sense.
Because rights can be in conflict with one another. So that becomes very tricky. There's a flip side to rights, which is responsibility. I've been, incredibly privileged to spend a lot of time in Indigenous communities and learning from Indigenous people. And the concept of responsibility is talked about quite a bit as something that comes hand in hand with the rights. You hear about it in terms of responsibility to the land, responsibility to the community, responsibility to the animals. There are all sorts of responsibilities that people acknowledge, and often the rights side of the responsibility is about the jurisdiction to execute those responsibilities.
Right. They need to be there. They need to have the authority granted, in a sense, or to grant it to themselves. And this is interesting because when we had Keith Matthew on, he actually talked a lot about that. They kicked out a bunch of the Indian agents and said, "We're just running this now," and they just took responsibility for it, and it flourished. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a lot of what they want. Yeah, I love that. Yeah,
for sure. And you'll hear this concept quite a bit in Indigenous policy discussions of occupying the space, which is, this question of Indigenous communities really taking on their right to self-determination, which is a right that Indigenous communities have, and in doing so, exercising their responsibilities.
I love that. And then let's talk about interests in this context too, because I think that when we talk about this, let's say, complex policy issue, and then lay out these three principles, and then I want to try to do it in another vein, so just so people can understand it contextualized instead of philosophic.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, the interest piece is a different angle on a similar question. You can negotiate interests, right? You had an interest for me to come onto this podcast. I had an interest to appear. It was a very easy negotiation.
Right.
We negotiated at the time.
Yep.
And I showed up. There can be, more difficult negotiations. But if folks understand principally that they are negotiating from a place of interest, they can have that discussion a lot easier. There are lots of examples where this pops up, particularly with Indigenous businesses. Recently, the Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia.
Yes, I love this example. Yeah,
this is a great one. So the Mi'kmaq, there's a Supreme Court case, the Marshall decision, that found that the Mi'kmaq have the right to a moderate livelihood fishery, and there's an entire rights-based stream of that question that's ongoing. Folks might be aware of conflicts in the traditional fishery that have been happening in Nova Scotia over the last year, and there's this entire rights-based vein that's ongoing. And separate from that rights-based discussion, there's also a large interest in actually fishing,
right?
And the economic benefits that come with that. All sorts of other benefits that I won't
traditional lifestyle
as to
these
why
kind of
people
things,
want to go down that road. But the end result is that not too long ago, the Mi'kmaq, again fully separate from their rights-based discussions about fishing, a consortium of Mi'kmaq communities purchased out Clearwater Seafood along with a BC-based company who was a partner to the deal. And as a result, the Mi'kmaq now effectively own, a large share of the East Coast fishery. That was an interest, right? That they exercised their interest, and now, the outcome is a lot of
we own it. Yeah.
Great economic benefit.
Yeah, exactly. Let's go into on a personal level. What does it look like to exercise your interest without being disagreeable? And maybe just on a raw, personal example, what are ways that could be done? Because I find there's this idea in, let's say, capitalist society, and I consider myself a big fan of capitalism, but that, there's scarcity, and therefore if I exercise my interest, that means that you're losing out. Can we reflect on that for a moment and maybe how that is just wrong thinking?
Well, relationships can't be zero sum. Right. And I think that's just a basic principle. And through collaboration, you're often growing the pie as opposed to, taking pieces of the pie out. And I think that, people not always, but by and large, will find themselves in that position, and an understanding that a collaboration will enable them to do more things that they couldn't do on their own. I think that's a super important principle to it. On that personal side of things, I think that we deal with this every single day, right?
Right.
A lot of interests are really simple. You want to watch movie A, your roommate wants to watch movie B. You will figure it out. You're not going to hate each other and
right. Yeah.
break the TV over it. It can get a little bit trickier sometimes in business. Sure, it can get a little bit trickier on other personal things. And a lot of, this comes down to how emotionally invested are you in an outcome, and how able are you as an individual to borrow a baseball metaphor, to hold the bat lightly.
Right. Yeah. And do you think, but I like your thoughts on it. Do you think that holding the bat lightly is also how you're able to have diverse friendships? Like not holding so tightly to your own ideas of reality or your own interests, perhaps, that they make you disagreeable?
I think I am wrong more often than I am right. And that is a philosophic viewpoint I personally hold, that I think makes it a lot easier for me to, not just easier, very pleasurable for me to hear from people that I disagree with. It is the best way for me to rigor test ideas. But I don't know. I mean, what's your philosophy on it?
No, I think I agree with you. It's and this is built over time, but it's this idea of being less wrong, right? It's like the goal is not to be right. And I think way too often people attach their identities and their very being to being right, to having the, this is the truth. And I think that's actually the dogmatism that causes rifts and is anti-diversity, is this idea that no, my identity is now attached to this idea of rightness. And if someone challenges that idea of rightness, they're not challenging an idea anymore. They haven't separated themselves from ideas about reality, and they've attached themselves to that idea. And therefore it actually doesn't feel anymore like a discussion. Now it's you're violating their identity. And in my mind, and you and I have talked about this a fair bit, identity should be largely fluid, only because why would you emotionally attach yourself to ideas external from yourself, right? And of course we do that, but I think the further you get at understanding that is a construct that you've created and not a reality that you must maintain, you become much more interested in observing the world than you do about saying things about the world. And I liked what you said. I couldn't agree more. It's like, I think I'm wrong more than I'm right. People might be like, oh, why would you think that? Because that's the best way to think, right? Because otherwise you're more often than not going to end up in a position of conflict and disagreeableness, defending something that you might not even be right about.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, I agree. And you'll end up in negative conflict.
Because there's positive conflict. Do you want to make that distinction for people? Because I think that's important.
Yeah, for sure. There's something that a colleague of mine often says to me, which is that tough conversations aren't bad. Remember, the start of conversing, is with, right? And similarly, right, a conflict is a relationship with somebody,
right?
But conflicts don't have to be destructive. Conflicts can be incredibly productive. Conflicts can lead to some of the best ideas possible. It all depends on whether as to whether or not parties are escalating conflicts and making it, worse and nasty and pulling in other people to backstab and to get people on their side. Or, that's the bad side of things. The positive side of things is, hey, you and I disagree. Let's chat about it. I want to understand your view. And if you approach conflict from a place of curiosity first,
I like that.
It is possible to have very, very good, productive, healthy, generative conflicts.
What do you think it is about people? What is it, that attitude of being wrong? I love that. Approach conflict first from the place of curiosity. I think that is absolutely key. The conflict should not be a competition, right? And I think too often we make these things competitive because again, they want to be right, as opposed to curious, which just means discovery. Have you? This might be something that just comes naturally to you. It certainly has in our relationship. But you weren't. Were you always this way? How did you develop this skill set?
No, I wasn't always this way. And I mean, even still, I struggle, right, to try and maintain that viewpoint and try and live it in practice. Everybody is a constant ongoing work, myself included, and none of us are perfect. We're all deeply flawed in our own ways. I don't know. I mean, I think as long as people approach questions with a little bit of humility, and understand that being wrong is a great learning opportunity, then the rest can happen. Now, that's not to say that I don't sometimes take things personally when I'm wrong.
Right.
I absolutely do.
Yeah.
But being able to take the step back, I try and check myself on it, and I have no shame apologizing afterwards when I've gone down a path that I'm not extremely happy about in my reaction.
So one last thing that I want to talk about, because I've always enjoyed it a lot about you, and it's, I think, maybe a little known fact, but you really enjoy death metal, music in general. You've had a great relationship with music. You and I have had a great relationship with music. Can you share a little bit about what it was like growing up in Long Island, going to see these bands that we all know, like Brand New, and I love your stories on this, and I'm sure we have a lot of musical listeners. Zach's big in the music industry, and I love your passion for this. So talk about being, a teenager on Long Island, going and seeing these bands we've all come to love, but you were there while they were coming up.
Oh, it was great. So first off, when I was growing up, my dad worked in the record industry. Coolest dad in the world, took me to go see Marilyn Manson and Slayer. We saw Pantera, all the time. He would, take me to these things. And I actually remember, at a Marilyn Manson concert, I was probably 12 or 13. Somebody walking up to me and my dad and her looking at me and then looking at my dad and then stopping and going, "Are you his dad?" And my dad being like, "Yes." And of course, I was a teenager. I was mortified about it. And this Marilyn Manson fan looking at me and going, "One day you're going to remember this, that you have the coolest dad in the world."
Right.
So I grew up with all of that, and my dad was hugely encouraging of my love for metal, all forms of metal.
Right.
And then when I was in high school, something really cool happened on Long Island, which was the Long Island emo and hardcore scene got really, really big. So at the time, looking back, I'm sure these were all horrible things from insurance points of view. But people rented out garages in industrial parks and used to throw shows in them all the time. So a lot of these, some of the bands that you've mentioned, a lot of really interesting, musicians kind of circled through Long Island at the time. And it was just this craziness of punk rock, death metal, emo, which didn't really fit into the rest, but it was cool.
Right.
Folks went for it anyway. In industrial parks. There was also this great house. The town next to me where I grew up is called Huntington, where some musicians, had a home that they all lived in together. They called it Hobo House. They used to throw just crazy basement shows all the time. They had a recording studio in there, and they pumped out some of the most interesting music in the world. And actually, they're while Hobo House no longer exists, I think I saw it on a real estate listing a few weeks ago.
Oh wow!
Those folks are still involved in Long Island music, and that entire scene is still there. From where I grew up, they've just matured a little bit,
right? They're not quite as crazy as they were. Yeah. So, can you share one memory of a band that maybe some of our listeners would love that you just got to experience and what that was like?
Yeah, sure. I'm thinking for a moment. I remember my first time seeing Taking Back Sunday.
Yes, this is the one that I wanted you to tell.
That was really cool. So there's, I'm not a historian on Long Island music by any means, but when I was growing up, Taking Back Sunday and Brand New were both getting pretty big at around the same time. And at least amongst fans, there was a bit of a rivalry between the two of them. Yeah. And I kind of recall them, making shirts about one another that you would see people wearing. And, if one wanted to go through the lyrics to Déjà Entendu and the lyrics to Tell All Your Friends, you'll see that there are like cross references to one another.
It's almost like a rap battle.
Yeah, a little bit, little barbs at one another. But yeah, the first time I saw Taking Back Sunday, if I remember correctly, it was in a block party in this town called Amityville. They were really good. I had no idea who they were. I was a teenager. And then a few weeks later, or months later, probably a few, who knows. Back in the day, there was AOL Instant Messenger that all the kids on Long Island had. And all of a sudden, the same, quotes from Taking Back Sunday kept appearing on everybody's away messages.
Yeah, because that's what you would do back then for the listeners who were too young. If you had MSN or AOL, you put like quotes in your name.
Totally. So just these song quotes, you would instant message somebody, the precursor, I guess, to text messages, and you would get that back automatically. I don't know. I feel like there's too many stories. It's tough to say. It's tough to kind of to share what the environment was like, except there were so many things happening all the time. And one of the most interesting things about it is, at that point in time on Long Island, it was a real repudiation to this idea of sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Right.
A lot of it was straight edge, right? So you'd go to these shows, there was no alcohol, there was no tobacco. It was really frowned upon if anybody brought that with them. There were no drugs. There was nothing that you would think of as being this, romantic.
No, it was just the love of the music.
It was purely the love of the music. It was a huge community. The community did outstanding and amazing things. It was, there's no words to describe it except to say that I think it gave me a tremendously positive trajectory because my high school years were surrounded by a straight edge music scene.
Yeah, I love that. Well, we're nearing the end, and I know you've got to go soon too, but what would you like to leave listeners with about Canada and about Canada, and maybe a little bit of a thought on where we could end up as a country?
The great thing about Canada is the openness, the exploration. There are always, responsibilities that come with being a citizen of Canada, or living here and being a citizen of the society in general, which is really to continue to exercise that ability to disagree without being disagreeable, to engage in good conversations, to continue to be welcoming, because Canada is so open. We can import very bad ideas very easily. We can accidentally find ourselves fighting in the conflicts of others that don't necessarily speak to whatever our domestic reality is. And as long as Canadians continue to just follow those core principles, I feel like there's nothing stopping Canada from being the most culturally influential country in the world.
Ah, yes. That is the dream that Dan and I have been talking about for a decade, folks, and I'm just so pleased that he came on. Thank you, Dan. I'm sure we'll have you on again, but thank you for your wisdom that you shared in my life and the openness that you've created in my heart. Thank you for listening to The Canadian Story. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at The CAD Story. That's the CAD Story. If you enjoy this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. Let's work together to remind Canadians how great their country is.